Hi, my name is Larry Wheeler, and this is my presentation for research paper number 2 on authentication. In the space that is software and software security, there are a variety of different problems that could arise. There's things like bugs, authentication issues, cross-site scripting, SQL injections, just a bunch of different things that could go wrong within the code that would leave the code compromised and able to be exploited by attackers. But today I decided to choose authentication as the subject of the presentation. With authentication, it's like the first thing that users or attackers interact with when they try to access an application. So I felt that that's the one I wanted to pick to try and pinpoint why it was such an important attack vector and important for us to be able to secure it within software. In the space that is software and software security, there are a variety of different problems that could arise. There's things like bugs, authentication issues, cross-site scripting, SQL injections, just a bunch of different things that could go wrong within the code that would leave the code compromised and able to be exploited by attackers. But today I decided to choose authentication as the subject of the presentation. With authentication, it's like the first thing that users or attackers interact with when they try to access an application. So I felt that that's the one I wanted to pick to try and pinpoint why it was such an important attack vector and important for us to be able to secure it within software. Essentially, authentication is the process of a user providing credentials of some sort to the application or the system. And the authentication system is supposed to validate that user's identity to prove that that person is who they say that they are. With the proper authentication controls put into place, it will only allow users with authorized accounts to be able to access the system. And if it's working as intended, it should be effective at keeping attackers out of the system, as an attacker more often than not will not have an authorized account to actually utilize the system. So with that being said, when a hacker does gain access to a system, they are able to sometimes elevate their access. So they might not always need administrator users. If they could gain access to maybe 3 or 4 accounts, they will be able to use those 3 or 4 accounts to be able to do enough damage to really harm the system or start stealing data. But if they are able to access an administrator or a super user account, then that gives them all the power that they need to do some serious damage to any system. It also depends on the purpose of the application, but more often than not, if they're able to even access the application at all, then they would definitely have the tools necessary to inflict heavy damage within the system. So there has also been several high-profile real-life examples of poor authentication being implemented into systems with billions of records of customer data that should have been protected very securely that wasn't. The first of which was with the first American financial real estate company in 2019. Essentially, they had a bunch of customer data hosted online with no authentication controls whatsoever. So basically, anyone with internet access was able to look up this information and find the customer records just hosted on the internet with no No security, no passwords, no usernames, nothing. Just a document hosted online that anyone was able to access. With this incident, nearly 1 billion customer records were basically compromised because they were just available for anyone to see online. Another incident happened with the IRS branch in South Carolina. Essentially, they were attacked, and the attackers were able to retrieve credit card information and social security numbers. It was later discovered that that breach was a result of the password on the authentication server being default. They never changed the authentication server password from the default password. So that is how the attackers were able to then get inside of that system to retrieve customer data. And then there was another incident in 2015 with the IRS. And this time, attackers were able to retrieve social security numbers, addresses, incomes, just a bunch of personally identifiable information for more than 700,000 people. They were able to pivot essentially once gaining access to the system, piggybacking off of the default password fiasco in 2012, which was never fixed. So a lot of people's money security and trust was damaged in the process due to the system not being up to par as far as security goes and the authentication methods not being up to par. So in terms of strengthening authentication, there's a multitude of different ways that you can go about it, but essentially the bread and butter is to use multi-factor authentication. And using multi-factor authentication basically has users use multiple forms of authentication. There's something you have, something you know, something you are, and there can be something you do. So there has to be a combination of at least two of those that are used to successfully authenticate into a system. With that being said, the first one is biometric authentication, which is something you are. So with that, you would most commonly use a fingerprint in order to gain entry into a building, or if it's like a super secure building, you could use an iris scanner to scan your eye. That way the system knows that you are exactly who you say you are. Following that, we have our certificate-based authentication, which is kind of a new one. With certificate-based authentication, you basically are using a digital certificate to identify either yourself, your machine, or your device. You have to identify yourself in order to gain access to a resource, a network, or an application. And at the same time, it employs mutual authentication. And with mutual authentication, both parties involved have to identify themselves to one another before a connection can be made. So the device has to identify itself before connecting to a network, and then the network has to identify itself before connecting to a device. It has to the authentication has to go both ways, and this is basically one of my favorites because it's never fail proof, but it would be extremely hard for an attacker to try to exploit this type of authentication, being that both the device or user and the network or application that they're trying to access has to basically identify themselves to one another. Following that, we have token-based authentication, and with token-based, this falls under something that you have. And with that, the item could be like a smart card or a token device. And with the token device, the token will basically generate like a one-time code every so often, like every minute or every 5 minutes or something like that. And while logging into a system, you'll need to provide the code on that device to prove that you are who you say you are. And finally, of course, we have the traditional username and password combination, but that is best when used in conjunction with one of the other three types of authentication that were just explained. In closing, authentication is a very important part of software security and should be treated as such, because it can be exploited, and once it's exploited, attackers are able to gain access to systems that they should not be able to, and once they have that access, they can steal data, they can damage systems, they can essentially do whatever it is that they want to. And the most effective way to stop them from doing this is to implement some type of multi-factor authentication that uses two of a bunch of different authentication methods, which would be something you have, something you do, something you know, or something you are. At least two of those choices would go a long way towards making authentication methods a lot stronger. In my opinion, I think strengthening authentication controls will get easier over time as more things like certificate-based authentication are introduced and developed over time, because something like certificate-based authentication is fairly new and it's most commonly used with cloud platforms like AWS or Microsoft Azure. So I think over time, those will get a lot stronger and authentication will be a lot easier to strengthen. And with that being said, thank you for listening and have a great day.